For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
The Democrats lose their father figure as brain cancer claims Edward M. Kennedy.
He became not only one of the greatest senators of our time, but one of the most accomplished Americans ever to serve our democracy.
Had so many of his foes embrace him because they know he made them bigger.
He was born rich but spoke for the poor. He was written off as a young man but died one of America's most respected. And he spent half a century at the center of his nation's history. But Teddy Kennedy was also perhaps the ultimate machine politician who never quite shed the controversy of Chappaquiddick. Tonight we assess a life filled with darkness as much as glamour, with tragedy as much as service. And as the last survivor of Camelot passes, why is America, the land of meritocracy, so enthralled by political dynasties? Also tonight, how's this for a vision? Network Rail propose a high-speed link to get from London to Glasgow in 2 hours 15. Can we afford it? And will Big Brother please leave the Big Brother house? Channel 4 calls time on the reality Godfather that changed TV and our whole concept of celebrity.
And the other headlines tonight. A reminder of the dark days of the 80s. The sports minister condemns the violent scenes between West Ham and Millwall fans. Britain's ambassador to Afghanistan defends the role of the military after it's reported that just 150 people managed to vote in one area where some of the worst fighting took place. And a former SAS soldier breaks his regiment's vow of silence to talk about the extent of mental health problems faced by members of the Special Forces.
The dream will never die is what Teddy Kennedy said in 1980 as his own presidential hopes were crumbling. But the end of those ambitions gave birth to a Senate career like no other. He championed causes before they became fashionable and was a power broker to the end. But the only Kennedy brother to die of natural causes never quite escaped the scandal of leaving his female passenger to die in the Chappaquiddick car crash. Amid lengthy tributes from around the world, Barack Obama said he was heartbroken. From Washington, here's our international editor, Lindsay Hilson.
His extraordinary life on this earth has come to an end. An extraordinary good that he did lives on. For his family, he was a guardian. For America, he was a defender of a dream.
He's left a great void in our public life and a hole in the hearts of millions of Americans and hundreds of us who were affected by his personal touch.
Senator Edward Kennedy, felled by a brain tumor at 77, mourned by America's leaders, a man whose controversial life spanned a generation and whose family tragedies have haunted American politics.
Senator Edward Kennedy was the last in his generation of the nearest America has to a royal family, and he served 47 years in the Senate. In his youth, he was a drinker and a playboy, and it seems that he spent much of his later years trying to redeem his past. He was the son of extreme privilege, but he spoke for the underprivileged. His was an extraordinary life.
Rose Kennedy said her 9 babies were rocked to political lullabies. His father apparently didn't think much of Edward, the youngest, but all 3 elder brothers were to meet violent deaths. Teddy, as he was known, was to inherit the mantle.
That the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
John Kennedy's swearing in as president was the family's greatest moment, the era called Camelot. His assassination in 1963 may be its worst. Edward Kennedy was 31, a newly elected senator, and campaigner for the second brother, Bobby. When he was murdered 5 years later, Teddy Kennedy became the patriarch of the dynasty and its political hope.
Like my 3 brothers before me, I pick up a fallen standard. sustained by their memory of our priceless years together, I shall try to carry forward that special commitment to justice, to excellence, to courage that distinguished their lives.
And that was when disaster struck. Driving back from a party, his car veered off a bridge at Chappaquiddick. He survived, but his passenger, Mary Jo Kopechne, drowned. Some said he was drunk. He failed to report the accident for 10 hours and was given a 2-month suspended sentence for leaving the scene.
I do not seek to escape responsibility for my actions by placing the blame either on the physical and emotional trauma brought on by the accident or on anyone else. I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident to the police immediately.
He wanted to fulfill the family ambition to be president, but the shadow of Chappaquiddick never lifted, and he lost the nomination to Jimmy Carter in 1980 after faltering on the most basic question.
Why do you want to be president?
Well,
After he conceded, he made what became his most famous speech.
For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
In the Senate, he became the most eminent champion of liberal causes. Having already campaigned against the Vietnam War, he now sponsored legislation against apartheid in South Africa and dictatorship in Chile. He described universal health care in America as the cause of his life. They're arguing about it still.
As long as I have a voice in the United States Senate, it's going to be for that Democratic platform plank that provides decent quality of health care, north and south, east and west, for all Americans, as a matter of right and not of fortune.
And although he was in American terms very left-wing, a scion of the Democrats, he became well known for doing deals with Republicans to get legislation through.
He is a fabulous United States Senator.
Last year, he was given an honorary knighthood by the Queen for his role in bringing peace to Northern Ireland.
It's time again for a new generation of leadership. It is time now for Barack Obama.
By the time he endorsed Barack Obama for president, he knew he was dying. But he rose from his hospital bed to go to the Democrat convention. It seems he saw Obama as a new John Kennedy.
The work begins anew. The hope rises again. And the dream lives on.
President Obama acknowledged his debt with a 77th birthday party featuring stars of politics and show business. As a Catholic, he knew he had sinned. But this is an American story. Edward Kennedy's name is on hundreds of pieces of legislation. By the time of his death last night, he was regarded in the US Capitol as well and truly redeemed. Lindsay Hilsum, Channel 4 News, Washington.
Well, earlier today, I spoke to the US Ambassador to Britain, Louis Sussman, a long-standing friend of Edward Kennedy, who raised funds for him during that unsuccessful presidential bid in 1980. I asked him what the news meant to him.
It's a sad day for those that loved and worked with Senator Kennedy. He was a giant in so many ways.
You knew him pretty well. I mean, we only see the public side. Tell us about him.
Well, I've known Senator Kennedy I knew him for 30 years. I knew him as a great, great champion of the most important causes. I knew him as an incredibly family man who was really the father to not only his children, but to Bobby's children and to President Kennedy's children, and was the patriarch to the family. But I also knew him as a friend who liked to play tennis, a friend who liked to sail, and most of all, he had a wonderful sense of humor.
I mean, we've often seen him as a sort of a tragic character, the loss of his 3 brothers, Chappaquiddick, and everything that sort of surrounded it. Was he a tragic figure at all, or had he managed to get beyond that?
I think he was a recipient of tragic affairs in his life, with his brother's death and his nephew, John Kennedy, and all of those type of deaths and other tragedies. But he never let it get it down. Teddy was always up, and Teddy was always positive, and Teddy was a leader among the family as well as in the country.
We have all sorts of different images of the Kennedy clan. I mean, what actually motivated him? Was it something that he was just sort of born into, that you would become powerful, you would become a senator or a presidential candidate, or was he actually motivated by public service?
Well, I think that Senator Kennedy is the youngest in that family of 9, and you had a brother who was president and another brother who was attorney general. He always felt there was a need that he had to prove himself as to his competence and excellency over and above anyone else because of that great heritage and tradition. But he is a man who has led so many great causes in his own right, and there's just no question in my mind that his legacy probably will exceed that of his 2 brothers because of what he did, but also because he had more time.
Could you say what his biggest achievement was, in your opinion?
I believe his single biggest achievement was his ability to take up the causes that were so dear to him and his brother Bobby, to his family, that other people weren't so totally committed to. Healthcare, immigration, human rights, women's rights. Because you have to remember, in the early days, and when healthcare was he was pushing healthcare, there were votes in the United States said 89-4 or 88-5, and he was a lonely figure in those days, but he never gave up, and I believe it'll all come to fruition.
The US ambassador talking to me earlier on the News at Noon. Well, joining me now from New York is Time magazine's political columnist Joe Klein. Take us back to the early 70s, if you will, that period after the death of JFK and Bobby Kennedy and the Chappaquiddick disaster. Edward Kennedy must have been shattered.
He was shattered. I mean, he was my relationship with him goes back 40 years. He was the first big league politician I ever covered. And the first place I ever covered him was like a classic American event. It was a Greek picnic in Lowell, Massachusetts. And you had all of these politicians swirling around, several of whom would run for president themselves, Michael Dukakis, Paul Tsongas, and they all had their jackets slung over their shoulders and their shirt sleeves rolled up, trying to look informal and charismatic, trying to look like Ted Kennedy. And there he was, looking like a ghost. He was dressed all in black. He had a black tie on. He was very stiff and awkward. His back had been broken in a plane crash, and that had been aggravated in the Chappaquiddick, events. And for those first few years that I knew him, maybe for that whole first decade until he ran for president, he was a very awkward public figure. Almost as if he were embarrassed, almost as if he were afraid that around the next corner someone with a gun was going to shoot him.
And he was in his 30s.
You didn't want to be in this...
sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
He was in his 30s as a US senator. Was he remotely competent as a senator then?
Well, he was just beginning to build his career, but I think that he really didn't come to terms and focus directly on the Senate until after he ran for president, which is what he was expected to do. And it wasn't just the kind of family expectation, but everybody in the Democratic Party expected him to run in 1972, and he didn't do it. And then again in 1976, and he didn't do it. And finally, he did it in 1980 in a very divisive sort of way. And when he lost, I was with him the day he knew he was never going to be president, day of the New Hampshire primary in 1980. And Kennedys just don't lose elections in New England. But he lost that one. And he almost became a different person that day. That night, he gave, just a slashing, exciting speech. very much unlike the awkwardness that I had seen the 10 years previous to that. And at that point, he really began to focus on the Senate and on building the record that he has accomplished.
I mean, did he ever shed his demons from what you saw?
Yes, I think ultimately he did. Those demons were fierce. They existed for a long time. It didn't, the heavy drinking and womanizing didn't end, with his presidential campaign. It continued. But when he met Victoria Reggie, his wife, he really began to settle into old age, to become much easier in public. He let his native humor and irony show a lot more. Wicked sense of humor. And by the last time, I saw him, we could sit and reminisce about the 40 years that we had spent together. He was devoted to Cape Cod. He was an oil painter, a devoted one, if not a very accomplished one. And by that point in his life, he knew that he had set a new standard for senatorial excellence, that he had had tremendous influence on his colleagues in how they behaved and how they saw the legislative process and how they learned to make compromises to win. One of his last great achievements was a compromise he made with George W. Bush on an education plan, national education plan.
Do you think he leaves American politics a much more colorless place, or are there other figures who could be as big?
Well, I think that there are the current president of the United States is a relatively enormous, huge figure who is not colorless, although he doesn't have the kind of broad swath, doesn't cut the kind of broad swath that Kennedy did. But Kennedy represents the last of a kind of great, over-the-top, windy generation of Irish politicians, especially those from Massachusetts, people like Tip O'Neill and Kennedy's brothers.
Joe Klein, many thanks for joining us. It's an ambitious vision that could see rail journey times between London and Glasgow halved to just over 2 hours. Network Rail is proposing a £34 billion high-speed rail link from the capital to Birmingham, Manchester and Scotland. The plan needs government approval, and the Transport Secretary said today that Network Rail had made a powerful case. But can such a large-scale building project really survive the predicted squeeze on public spending? Here's our political correspondent, Kathy Newman.
This is the future, and it goes at 200 miles an hour. The company that owns and operates Britain's railways wants the next generation to be able to board a train in Glasgow first thing in the morning, ending up in London for breakfast just 2.25 hours later. If that seems extravagant, wait until you hear the cost of the proposed high-speed route, £34 billion. But according to Network Rail's chief executive, that's a price worth paying.
We're forecasting a situation where the railways in these areas become full up, and at that point you won't be able to get any more people on it. So people will either won't travel or they'll be forced onto roads or into planes, and I think that's the wrong decision. We should be providing a service that attracts as many people as you possibly can onto the railways. So the consequence of not making investment like this is overcrowded roads and pressure on the airports.
Britain already has one high-speed line from London through the Channel Tunnel. The new route would link London with Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow and Edinburgh, stopping off at Warrington and Preston. Living life at twice the speed would over 60 years bring about £55 billion in revenue from fares and economic benefits, according to Network Rail. People would have more time to earn and spend money, as the new train timetable would dramatically shorten journeys from London to cities in northern England and Scotland. The train from London to Glasgow currently takes 4 hours 31 minutes. This would be cut to 2 hours 16 minutes. London to Manchester at the moment takes 2 hours 7 minutes. That would go down to 1 hour 6 minutes. And London to Birmingham, now 1 hour 22 minutes, would take less than an hour, just 46 minutes.
Well, I'm in the cab of a train hurtling down Britain's first high-speed rail line. And I can tell you the driver's speedometer has just hit 207 kilometres per hour. That's just over 125 miles per hour. And it feels pretty fast. But the new project is that much more ambitious. This bit of track just stretches for 68 miles from central London to the Channel Tunnel. The new one would go all the way up the backbone of Britain, more than 400 miles.
Whereas this cost £7.3 billion, the bill for the second would come to almost 5 times that. So it's all the more surprising that despite the eye-watering sums involved, all 3 main political parties have now climbed on board.
The man asked by the government to assess the case for a new high-speed network suggests one reason for the cross-party support. The politicians don't need to find the money immediately.
You're not going to start construction of a high-speed network much before, say, 2017, 2018. That's the other side of the current problems with the public sector finances. So you probably got free of that. And the other is, if you're going to build a high-speed network through to Scotland, you don't do that in 5 minutes or even 5 years. It's the work of, well, perhaps a generation, so you can spread that cost out over time as well.
Tomorrow's travellers could look forward to a greener future. Network Rail forecasts the new route would cut carbon emissions and reduce air journeys by 3.6 million a year. But passengers too will have to pay for the privilege. Fares will be up to 30% higher than on regular lines.
Cathy Newman. A disgrace to football, the Sports Minister has condemned the violent scenes at last night's match between West Ham and Millwall in London. Emily has the details and more of today's news.
Jerry Sutcliffe said the hooliganism at Upton Park was a grim reminder of the dark days of the 80s. Hundreds of fans clashed before, during and after the game, and a 44-year-old man was stabbed in the chest.
It could be the 1980s all over again. The Football Association and the football clubs all hoped they'd seen an end to scenes like this. But last night, as fans arrived to see West Ham play old rivals Millwall for the first time in 4 years, the crowd turned into a violent mob as the police tried to keep both sets of fans apart. It all happened just outside the Queen's pub.
About 5:30, 6, a gang of youngsters, not West Ham fans, they didn't come for the match, they come looking for trouble. They mixed in with these and then they start chanting, "We hate Millwall, we all this and that."
The local resident who filmed these images from a balcony said at one point the crowd turned on him.
I actually felt threatened for my life. I had to duck for cover and lay down behind this signboard to avoid getting hit by any glass bottles.
The police say this violence was planned, premeditated, probably by fans on both sides, eager to reignite some of the old rivalries. And it started well before kick-off, when Millwall fans came out of the tube station here behind me and came to face a line of police. 5 hours later, the fighting was still going on. As early as 6 o'clock, there were clashes with riot police just outside Upton Park Tube. The police then tried to lead Millwall fans arriving along side streets to the stadium to avoid the West Ham fans. Kick-off was at 7:45, and as news of the trouble outside filtered into the ground, the pitch was invaded 3 times. West Ham won the match 3-1, but the result was obscured when some supporters dodged officials and made it onto the pitch. Millwall players had to be escorted off for their own safety. During the match at 8:25 and just behind the ground, a man was stabbed in Priory Road. And even at 11 o'clock, the fighting continued with the police outside the stadium.
This is hopefully a one-off, and that we'll deal with it. The fans involved will be banned for life. The police will deal with the criminal side of things that occurred. But it's important that we try and move forward and making sure that we don't have a repeat.
Unfortunately, there are people who like to pre-arrange disorder, usually using mobile phones. Whether you accurately describe them as football supporters or not is an interesting question.
The beloved statue of Bobby Moore, at least, was well protected, so the police knew violence was likely at the match. There'd even been discussions on fan forum websites. But despite this, the police still had to draft in 250 extra emergency officers to cope with the violence.
The Sri Lankan government has dismissed footage shown on this programme last night, apparently showing government troops executing Tamils, as a fabrication. The extremely distressing video you're about to see was obtained by an exiled group called Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka. The group claims it was filmed by a Sri Lankan soldier on his mobile phone in January of this year. But the Sri Lankan government says the video is an attempt by Tamil Tiger Front organisations to discredit the government. It denies the army has engaged in atrocities against the Tamil community and says it is the Tamil Tigers who commit unspeakable atrocities against women and children. The government's consumer watchdog is calling on the energy companies to cut household bills after accusing them of overcharging customers by almost £100 a year. Wholesale gas prices have fallen by nearly 2/3 in the past year, but customers have seen little, if any, of the benefit. The companies have always blamed the need to pay for supplies in advance for the discrepancy. So the watchdog Consumer Focus set out to model the energy companies' buying strategies to estimate what they do actually pay. They say that the current average gas bill is £808, but that should be 10% lower. And the annual electricity price is £445, but that should be 3.5% lower. Together, that amounts to saving of £96.40 on the average combined bill.
During this recession, there's not many consumers that wouldn't be grateful for a £100 reduction in their energy bill. It's one of the biggest bills in the home at the moment. It's even more of an issue for pensioners and families. So really, we're calling for companies to do the right thing.
For many, he's the greatest sporting hero of all time, so it was no surprise that the centre of Hyde in Manchester was brought to a complete standstill because of a visit by Muhammad Ali. To shouts from the crowd, the legendary boxer looked frail as he emerged from his car for a tour of a boxing club owned by another world champion, Ricky Hatton. Ali, who suffers from Parkinson's, is in Britain for a short tour to raise money for his charities.
After the break, Edward and Bobby Kennedy had presidential ambitions. Their brother JFK realised his. We look at the Kennedy dynasty and its dominant role in American politics. Welcome back. The British ambassador to Afghanistan has defended the role of the military following reports that just 150 people voted in one Taliban stronghold during last week's election. The low turnout on polling day was in the southern province of Helmand, around the area of Babaji. British forces engaged in fierce fighting with Taliban militants to secure the area ahead of polling day. Well, the cost for British soldiers was high, and today it has been announced that a British soldier has died in Birmingham Hospital over a week after he was wounded in Afghanistan. The soldier was injured while on foot patrol in Helmand. His family have been informed. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, is in Westminster. Does anyone actually know how many people voted in the Afghan elections in these areas?
No, they don't. And that's one of the reasons that the ambassador is not able to knock down this 150 turnout figure, this appalling figure that's been mooted for Babaji district. They just don't know. I understand that there is an expectation that across the whole of the south of Afghanistan, turnout could be somewhere between 10 and 30%. Now that would contrast with 40 to 50% across the whole of Afghanistan. That's the current working prediction for the entire turnout, and I understand there's real concern about certain areas. Babaji could be one of them. Kandahar, I understand, is another where there are serious concerns about very poor turnout.
Well, given the government said British forces were fighting the Taliban so that people could vote, I mean, how tricky is this going to be for the government?
Well, we've just had a statement from a senior figure in the MOD saying that low turnout or not, and this has yet to be verified, security in the area that was retaken by Panther's Claw will be enduring. The government is emphasising that the Operation Panther's Claw was about securing the area. It had only just been secured, so the ambassador, when he was briefing us down the teleconference from Kabul today, was emphasising that you wouldn't expect turnout to be very good in an area like this so soon after it had just been retaken from the Taliban, who'd been threatening and intimidating the voters. But even then, if the figure does turn out to be something like 150 in one district or as low as 10% across an area that the British have expended lives on, it's a gift to opponents of the war. The gruesome equation, 10 lives lost in Panther's Claw, British forces' lives, maybe as many as 150 injured, and people will say, to what benefit?
Gary Gibbon in Westminster. You're watching Channel 4 News. Our main headlines tonight. The sports minister has described last night's violence at a football match between West Ham and Millwall as a disgrace to football. A 44-year-old man was stabbed in the chest during fighting. Network Rail has unveiled proposals for a high-speed rail line between London and Glasgow that would halve journeys to just over 2 hours. And Edward Kennedy, veteran US senator, brother of JFK, has died at the age of 77 after suffering a brain tumour. President Obama said he was heartbroken. Well, Edward was the last of the Kennedy brothers to die, part of a dynasty that's had a powerful grip on the Democratic Party for decades. But are other families now taking their place, or is America falling out of love with political dynasties? They're a political dynasty who served their country for almost a quarter of its history. 3 brothers from Boston who, through their ambition and celebrity, would tower over American public life. But with Edward's death, has the chapter now closed on the Kennedy family's influence? Some of the next generation are in politics. Edward's son, Patrick, is a Rhode Island congressman. His niece, Maria Shriver, is California's First Lady. But another niece, Caroline Kennedy, failed to secure a New York Senate seat last year. For a country that prides itself on meritocracy, dynasties are surprisingly familiar. But the rivals to the Kennedys also look to be on the wane. The 2 Presidents Bush occupied the White House for 12 years, but the controversies of W's White House years look to have put paid to the hopes of his brother Jeb. And Hillary Clinton failed to follow Bill in 2008, suggesting the US has fallen out of love with the hereditary principle, perhaps bringing America into line with the UK, where all the recent prime ministers have emerged from non-political backgrounds. Well, I'm joined now by the political historians Dr. Tim Stanley and Professor Matthew Dallek, who's in Washington. Professor Dallek, why has America fallen for these dynasties? It seems so unmeritocratic.
Well, at least one element is that you have powerful name recognition. So if you are the son, or increasingly nowadays the daughter or a sibling of a famous household name, it's much easier and it's almost expected that you're going to run for political office. So with the Kennedys, the father, the patriarch of the family, for all 4 boys, there were 9 children, I believe, all 4 boys, he drove them very hard from a very early age to be engaged in public service, to run for office, and increasingly in American society as political branding becomes more and more important, it's at least one factor that's very helpful for entering public life.
Tim Stanley, how do you account for it? Is it something to do with them not having a royal family?
I think it's probably a great deal to do with that. Lacking some kind of inherited aristocracy, they instead look for people with equally charismatic, but shall we say, lunatic traits. The difference between us and America is when people vote for a president in the United States, they're voting for a personality as much as they're voting for a philosophy or a legislative agenda. So when you vote for a Kennedy, you're voting for a particular kind of personality or indeed brand. American politics is somewhat like a soap. It's their version of watching Crossroads.
Well, Matthew Dallek, what do you think is happening to these dynasties? I mean, the Clinton dynasty, I suppose, could go on with Chelsea. She put in some impressive performances in the last election. The Bush one, not looking so good.
Well, look, I think it's a fair point. For example, imagine if Chelsea Clinton at some point decided she wanted to run for public office. She would have a wealth of support from the millions of Americans and especially Democrats who, for various reasons, supported Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton. With the Bush family, Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, is still in the picture, even though he's no longer governor. So there is, it's conceivable that he could run for office at some point. I think, though, what's important to keep in mind is that, remember, with the Kennedys, there were 4 brothers. There was a very large family, much larger actually than most families you have today, and that it was instilled in them from very early on, much like with, say, the Brown family in California, Governor Pat Brown, Jerry Brown, Kathleen Brown, that they should all get into public life and political
But how did
office.
they get away with just giving Teddy Kennedy the Massachusetts seat when he was, he was 30 years old? He probably knew nothing.
Well, look, that's a really good question. Part of it is that, frankly, politics is a hard business in the United States, and if you wield power, as Ted Kennedy's brothers did, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, especially in Massachusetts, there is a real ability to set us. I mean, look, for example, at Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden left his Senate seat to become vice president. In place now in his Senate seat is his former chief of staff, and there is speculation that that Vice President Biden's son, when he returns from Iraq, will run for that seat. So this is how politics works. And if you're powerful, you can't guarantee that this will happen, but you can grease the wheels, so to speak.
Tim Stanley, could we see more of this in this country, or are we liberated from these shackles?
I think
when you look at Ewan Blair or Will Straw, I mean, are these going to be tomorrow's leaders?
Absolutely. As I say, it's all about the domination of American and British politics by the media, and it's all about developing a good storyline. The Kennedy is a good storyline. No matter how failed or traumatic that family or screwed up it may well be, it makes for good footage.
And as we become more presidential in our own system,
exactly, as we become more obsessed with image and branding in this country, it would not surprise me if in 20 or 30 years' time there was some horrible little Blair offspring or Cameron offspring that was thrust into the limelight as Blair Mark II. Having said that, very quickly, the appeal of a progeny is generational. It's what they're associated with. One of the reasons why people vote for Ted Kennedy is because he makes them think of the 60s. So we have to ask ourselves, will people vote for Ewan Blair because he makes them think of the 90s?
But if you look at Teddy Kennedy's life, particularly his later life, did he ever escape the sort of the shadow of his family and his expectations and become his own man?
Absolutely, and the tragedy of his passing is people will talk about Chappaquiddick a great deal in the next few weeks, and that is so sad because after he gave up on the presidency, he really became his own sort of person. He got down to legislating, he became a solid family man, he got a new marriage, he lost a lot of weight, he got off the booze, he stopped the affairs, and he became really quite a solid but very boring and accomplished man.
Matthew Dalek, was he still essentially a Kennedy in his style? Or did he change what being a Kennedy meant?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I don't think that actually, contrary to some of the conventional wisdom that's happening right now, I don't think he quite embodied the same kind of glamour in the 1960s that his two older brothers, John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, embodied. I think, as the other guest said, there was something almost more workmanlike about his career. He was in the Senate for 5 decades. The amount of legislation that he helped to author is really overwhelming. So, now he was very inspirational and he carried the liberal torch. And in that sense, I think he did embody that Kennedy style. I do think that, look, some of the scandals that have been associated with the family, that has affixed itself to him as well. But I do think that he really carved out for himself, in a way, losing the presidential campaign in 1980, there was something liberating about it because it allowed him to stay in the Senate, to say, I don't want to be in the White House, I want to be in public service and I want to help people. And I think, in that sense, it really gave him the freedom to define himself on his own terms as opposed to primarily being in his brother's shadows.
Matthew Dalek, Tim Stanley, thank you both very much indeed. A hill overlooking Canary Wharf, the location of the week-long climate camp, has finally been revealed. Back to Emily.
Protesters converged on Blackheath in southeast London from half a dozen locations across the capital, where they'd been waiting for a text message giving their final destination. Around 1,000 people joined the camp, which hopes to promote policies to tackle climate change. Organisers are hoping their numbers will grow as the week-long protest continues. Police, who'd been criticised for heavy-handed tactics at previous climate camps, today stood well back. Police have warned people responding to internet adverts to take care after a man was attacked in East London last month as he went to buy a car he'd seen advertised on the listings website Gumtree. The 42-year-old nearly died after he was beaten and stabbed by 2 assailants who tried to wrestle a bag containing around £5,000 from him on a busy street in broad daylight on July the 30th. Officers have already arrested a 20-year-old and a 16-year-old. They've released more details of the case in a bid to contact more witnesses. A British woman jailed in Laos on drugs charges has launched a legal challenge against her conviction. 20-year-old Samantha Orobator was sent back to Britain earlier this month to serve her life sentence here. Her lawyers have condemned what they call her disgraceful show trial and say her conviction was manifestly unsafe and shouldn't be recognised in this country. The computer giant Microsoft has been forced to apologise after its marketing department used a doctored photograph on a Polish web page. The image of 3 smiling white workers promoting business productivity might have passed unnoticed in Poland if it wasn't for the existence of the same shot on Microsoft's US website with a black man seated in the middle. The company says it's tracking down those responsible. They might also want to find out why the man's face was changed, but his hand remained black in the Polish advert. And the markets now, and at the close, the index of 100 leading shares was down by 26 points. A short time ago, the pound was down against the dollar by almost 1 cent, and sterling was down against the euro by 2/5 of a cent.
A former SAS soldier has broken the regiment's vow of silence to reveal the extent of mental health problems faced by members of the Special Forces. Ex-Corporal Bob Paxman says servicemen and women are being overworked with little time to recover between overseas missions, leading to a rise in cases of post-traumatic stress disorder. He says members of the Special Air Service are suffering particularly badly and estimates that half of the former SAS personnel he knows have serious behavioural problems. Carl Doonan reports.
I'm ex-Royal Engineers and ex-SAS. I've come through working in the security industry, working in Africa and Iraq, and a whole load of interesting places whilst I was serving.
Bob Paxman's service with the Special Forces and private security industry left him with psychological injuries.
So I got to a stage where I'd be on leave or where I'd be on holiday, that I'd be self-medicating, as everybody else does, with alcohol, to the point where I could go to sleep. At least I'd get a couple of hours sleep before the night terrors and the nightmares came back in again.
A lot of people end up considering or trying suicide. Did you reach that stage?
Well, yes, there was. I did attempt, myself a few years ago. Yeah.
Have you noticed that sometimes people have reasons for what they do?
Bob Paxman started his own charity, Talking to Minds, to treat ex-forces personnel dealing with similar problems. He says in his experience, such problems are particularly prevalent in the Special Forces community.
I know a whole bunch of the older guys that are suffering still to this day. If I was to try and put a number on it, I would imagine that it could be anything from sort of 50–60%. So certainly within the regiment, it's a case of talking to somebody. If you was to turn around and say, I can't deal with what I saw last week or what I was involved in last week, people are actually going to look sideways at you and go, you know what, I don't actually really want to work with that guy. He's a liability.
Other ex-SAS men support his assessment of the numbers who are suffering. Today, one former member of B Squadron's 7 Troop told Channel 4 News,
7 Troop of B Squadron was worse than most. Of the 18 SAS men I work with, 10 years on, 9 are dead. Topped themselves. Mysterious deaths overseas. Hanging in garages, gassing in cars. One jumped out of a plane without a parachute. Maybe it was the type of operations. Maybe it's just losing the sense of purpose. You're fighting terrorists up to the last minute and then you're out with nothing to do.
Special Forces aside, the sheer number of regular troops seeing frequent combat points to a future increase in psychological trauma. The MOD has commissioned a major survey from King's College.
There will be more people presenting with psychiatric injuries because the numbers of psychiatric casualties are closely linked to the numbers of physical casualties, and tragically the numbers of physical casualties has been going up.
But the King's survey will specifically exclude Special Forces, so the precise scale of their problem remains unknown.
The high level of problems amongst the Special Forces may be related to the very high levels of close combat that they have and the long exposure that they have. That's conjecture because, again, we don't have a huge amount of data. But it's very clear, anecdotally, that we have a problem.
The government says no part of the forces carries a greater psychological burden.
There's no evidence of greater mental health problems amongst those involved in the Special Forces compared to those who are not. And indeed, overall, there's no evidence that those who deploy to theatre have greater mental health problems than those who do not.
The King's survey into forces' mental health will be published in the coming months. The condition of the Special Forces will remain largely hidden.
After the break, it's been losing viewers and advertising revenue. Now Channel 4 decides to axe Big Brother after a decade of groundbreaking reality TV. Welcome back. It's Channel 4's most commercially successful show, but it's now being evicted from the schedules after a big drop in audience figures. Big Brother, which turned Jade Goody into a household name and sparked controversy during the Shilpa Shetty race row, will disappear from Channel 4 next year after 11 series. But it may find a home with another broadcaster. Our arts correspondent Nicholas Glass reports on a decade of reality television that's changed the media landscape.
Gone in a blink of an eye. Well, not quite. We've loved and hated Big Brother for a decade. In the ephemeral world of television, that's a lasting brand. And it all began so simply.
For the last 4 days, 10 people have been living together in a specially built house, completely cut off from the outside world.
Lisa and David are in the garden.
Mardi Gras today, call it Mardi Gras, don't they?
We Brits have been as loyal as any. The show was road tested in Holland in 1999 and then exported to the world. France, Italy, Croatia, South Africa, Thailand. BB, as its makers call it, is currently big in Brazil and in America, but looking a little tired over here. The current series is attracting an audience of 2 to 3 million, according to Channel 4. The tabloids, hitherto so important in keeping the show in the public eye, have largely ignored it.
You said to me, you were 100% certain that you were going to nominate. You said it in front of us all.
Like every week.
Channel 4 and the programme maker Endemol have been in discussions for several months now. The demise of Big Brother was leaked to the press, namely The Sun. And so when Kevin Ligo of Channel 4 came to the press conference this morning, he told us to settle down, housemates. This, he said, was a bittersweet moment. The fact is, Big Brother doesn't generate as much money as it used to. The show had its moments, its characters. Nasty Nick Bateman, George Galloway flanked by Pete Burns.
Now, would you like me to be the cat?
A feline Galloway pretending to lap milk.
You might be some princess Neverland.
The race row between Jade Goody and Shilpa Shetty. At its peak, the audience rose to 10 million. The show accounted, perhaps, for over 10% of the channel's entire income.
If 4 or 5 million people were still watching it, would you be killing it off?
I don't know. I'd like to think we probably would. I think there would be a very interesting balance commercially against the creative opportunity. But that isn't the case. It is now, though, as I said, commercially viable. I think the risk is worth taking commercially to help reinvent the channel again.
Big Brother was seen initially as a social experiment of cultural note. Arguably, it's become self-conscious, manipulative, not least in its choice of housemates.
It was the voice of a new generation, the noughties generation, that emerged a decade ago. A generation, young, diverse, individualistic, who felt that mainstream television was out of step with the way they saw the world. Big Brother changed all of that.
Big Brother seems to have fed an appetite for so-called real people on telly. Hence the revival in talent-freak contests. We watch them in our millions. Channel 4 is asking for big ideas from programme makers and has pledged more money for drama and comedy. Big Brother will end in 2010. Endemol will be hoping that some other channel, perhaps Sky, will commission it.
Can you name the people who are still left in the house?
Oh, I'm sure I could on top of my head, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to play that game.
How many are left?
I'm not even going to get into that game. That's a mug's game.
Nicholas Glass reporting. Tonight's main news, Edward Kennedy has died from brain cancer and will have his funeral on Saturday. He's attracted countless tributes, none more heartfelt than from his longtime Senate colleague, Joseph Biden, the US Vice President.
Teddy spent a lifetime working for a fair and more just America. And for 36 years, I had the privilege of going to work every day and literally, not figuratively, sitting next to him and being a witness to history. Every important event in my adult life, he was there. He was there. He stood with me when my wife and daughter were killed in an accident. He was on the phone with me literally every day in the hospital. Today, we lost a truly remarkable man. To paraphrase Shakespeare, I don't think we shall ever see his like again. But I think the legacy he left was not just in the landmark legislation he passed, but in how he helped people look at themselves and look at one another.
More 4 News is next at 8. We're back tomorrow at noon and then again at 7. Until then, from Emily and from me, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.